So I'm going to go back out to the West Coast. I told you the other day I was going to leave it in your hands. You let me know if you want this. We've been getting great traction on our swing game segments. And we've done them for the SEC, Big Ten. I think we've done them for all the Power 5 conferences now. And so I said, if you want it for the Pac-12, let me know. And overwhelmingly, kind of surprised me actually, the degree to which you overwhelmingly said, yes, we want it. So here we go. Pac-12 swing games. You asked for them. We are going to answer here. The swing game is not always your biggest game. The swing game is the one we circle, and we think that will, for better or for worse, determine how your season ended up playing out. Let's start with Oregon. You give me Washington State at Oregon. This is all the way down the road in week 11. We normally don't go that deep in the season for a swing game, but there are reasons here. This is as close as Oregon will have been in several years to being viewed as a viable playoff contender. Now, they've been a playoff contender in the past. They've had the preseason ranking. Top to bottom, this team's as good as they've had in quite a while, and it's as good a shot, therefore, as they've had in quite a while. The Pac-12 North game to circle is the one you're looking at right now on your screen if you're watching. It's November 6th. It's at Washington, but that's not the swing game. The swing game's the next week when Washington State comes into Eugene, and that is November 13th, and that's Washington State having a bye week right before that game. So either way, regardless of how that game at Washington plays out, it's going to be a knife fight, I think, the following week. They being Oregon, they could either be in do or die, back against the wall mode, or they could be in pole position and vying for maybe a trip to the Pac-12 championship game, but trying to keep playoff hopes alive too. And that game, I think, will be a huge swing because look at what they've got the next week. That thing is sandwiched right between trips to Washington and Utah. Not ideal. Moving on. USC, let's go down to LA. I picked Utah at USC as the swing game for the Trojans. Now, this is one of those examples where your biggest game is also your swing game. USC has to win the Pac-12 South this year. Everything has fallen their way. The schedule's fallen their way. Their biggest challenger, as many saw it, is dealing with NCAA investigation right now. And they're USC. So they should be the favorite every year to win this division. They got to win this thing, man. If they don't, independent of what the record ends up being, you know what, I'm not going to call for anyone's job in June. They need to win the Pac-12 and Pac-12 South at the very least. This game, this is the toughest schedule spot, and I think it's the toughest game overall, aside from the Notre Dame game. Utah at USC in Week 6. This is Southern Cal's 6th game in a row, schedule dynamic alert, whereas Utah has a bye the week before this. So it's not the best of times to draw your toughest of competition. And remember, in the SEC, or maybe even the Big Ten, if you're looking at it, you know, if you're Ohio State or Bama, I got some wiggle room. I can afford to lose a game. I'll just make up for it. I'll have strong opponents on the back end. I'll have a conference championship game. You don't have that wiggle room in the Pac-12. The perception of the conference is such that you have to be perfect or as close to perfect as it gets, which means you can't be losing games like this. It's going to be tough. You got to suck it up. You got to win it. So I'm going to take the Utah game for USC. Now, as for Washington, I'm not going to go with a conference game at all. The Washington Huskies, as I said earlier in the show, could very well be favored in every game they play. There are 2 games in question. The first one's the one we're about to talk about, at Michigan in Week 2. The other one is later on down the road against Oregon. And these are games they could be dogs in, they could be a favorite in. As of right now, they are a favorite in Week 2. And this is the swing game to me. Washington at Michigan, pretty rare matchup here. Week 2, that's the swing game. It's an out-of-conference game, obviously. If Washington comes into the big house and wins, I can't overstate enough what it would do for perception. This whole Week 2 slate for the Pac-12 has Washington going to Michigan. It's got Oregon going to USC. There are some other notable games. I don't have the helmet grid schedule in front of me right now. But it could either make or break the Pac-12. Unfair though that may sound, it could do it that early in the season, again, given the vulnerable perception of that conference. But this Week 2 game, Washington at Michigan, think about this. If they go in there and win, well, obviously they've won a really big game. They've won one of their toughest games. You see they have several winnable games after that. And so it could set them up for a nice little run to get into that stretch where they end up playing Oregon and Arizona State towards the end of the year. But if they lose it, again, there's no wiggle room in the Pac-12. And so if they lose against Michigan, you and I both know what the perception will be. You'll probably share this perception. You'll probably say, you know what? I don't think all that too terribly highly of Michigan right now. And Washington couldn't even go in there and beat them. And so whatever they go back out west and do the rest of the year, I'm going to have that in the back of my mind. You couldn't even beat Michigan. How am I supposed to take you seriously as a playoff contender? And that's what's on the line. That's why that's a swing game in week 2. It's big for Washington, but listen, if I were an Oregon fan, I'd be pulling for the Huskies in that game. If I were a Southern Cal fan, I'd be pulling for the Huskies in that game. They are representing more than just themselves in that game. Again, you don't have to think that way if you're in some other conferences. You do have to think that way right now if you're the Pac-12. What about Utah? Utah, bona fide contender. They are going to be some folks' preseason Pac-12 South pick. I'm taking Arizona State at Utah in week 7 as the biggest swing game for the Utes. It's a big swing moment, really. It's not just a swing game. It's a big swing moment for them because it's one of the hardest games to forecast. If you're looking on the screen right now, I've said that like 15 times tonight, look at where this game is. It's in week 7. It's Arizona State. So they've got at USC before that. They've still got Oregon down the road. But what is Arizona State right now? Arizona State could be a shell of themselves, or they could have gotten surprising good news, or no news being good news, and they could be fully the team we all expected them to be in preseason magazine season. And if that's the case, this is a tough spot to draw them. Coming off that USC game, that is Super Bowl territory for Utah. That game at USC, October 9th, that's Super Bowl territory. Well, as is the case usually, when we talk about a Super Bowl in college football, it's and who do they play the next week? Well, let's check who they play the next week. Well, you got Arizona State. Well, that's not the easiest draw in the world. The reason it's a hard forecast is because it may end up being such that you're favored by 3 touchdowns because Arizona State has completely cratered, or maybe they'll be legitimate. So you give me that game, Arizona State at Utah. That's in week 7. And the last one I wanted to touch on out west, UCLA's got a tougher schedule in the South than most of their other Pac-12 South brethren. They've got a game. It's going to be off the radar. This is not going to be a national game, but I think it's one of a it's going to be interesting to me only because of the dynamics. It is UCLA at Arizona. It's week 6. Think about how we reason all this in our minds. Look at the opening to this schedule. A lot of you would say their toughest game is for them in week 2. The rest of the country will call September 4th week 1, but UCLA has scheduled Hawaii in August. And so they will, I think, be 1-0. Then they've got a little stretch here. They play LSU. They will be less than a touchdown underdog in that game. We told you that long before it came out. They'll be favored against Fresno. They'll be favored at Stanford. And then you got Arizona State there, which will be around to pick 'em as we see it right now. And so you've got a chance there. It wouldn't be the wildest of scenarios if UCLA were to start 1-0, 2-0, 3-0, 4-0, 5-0, or 4-1 even would be a very good start. And then they go to Arizona. Now, I don't think if you're looking at the screen, it takes a rocket scientist to figure out why this would be a swing game. It's not because we expect a ton from Jed Fish in Arizona, and $5 if you could name the new Arizona head coach before we just said his name. Seriously, you deserve it. It's not that we expect a whole lot out of them in year 1. It's what happens if Chip Kelly and UCLA lose that game. Do you see the next 3 opponents on that schedule? You go into a tailspin really quickly because you lose at Arizona. They send you right back out on the road to Washington. And then you get to come home and play Oregon. And then you get to go back out on the road and play Utah. And then Colorado just feasts on whatever is left on the carcass at that point. I'm not guaranteeing that. I'm just saying you and I both know that's the way that could very well play out. So these are some really interesting swing games. I know some of you don't get into Pac-12 football. I would encourage you, being that this will be a renaissance year and all, I would encourage you to watch this. A lot of you gamble on this. A lot of you play day-to-day fantasy and week-to-week fantasy, and maybe you have a different kind of rooting interest, and then some of you are fans of Pac-12 programs. I think college football is the best when it matters nationwide. Now, you and I may wholeheartedly differ on our strategy on how to make that happen. You're an expand the playoff type. I am a make better hires type, including commissioner. So he's been there about 15 minutes. We'll see how much that pays off. But these are very intriguing. And what I love to do in December is I love to look back on our swing games, and I love to see how right we were. How impactful were these swing games? Or do we look back on and say, oh, Utah, as it turns out, they skull drug Arizona State 52-3. Not really a swing game at all. All that swung was the door, and then Arizona State got tossed out of it. But that's fun to watch.